I was coming over on the ferry this morning, and I was thinking about the time I came over on the ferry to meet you for the first time and write about the witness blanket, which I knew very little about. Someone had forwarded me a news release, and I thought, this sounds incredible. I want to write about it. And I came to your studio, which was in your backyard then, right?
Yeah.
You've come a long way.
Yeah.
You've got this beautiful place
space
now. Yes. Doesn't have a bathroom, as I learned, but it's lovely. It's gorgeous. Maybe we could start by talking about the conception of the project. How did the witness blanket come to you? How did you come up with the idea?
I mean, it kind of came out of a series of rejected ideas. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission made the call for commemoration initiatives, and because my dad is a residential school survivor and I'm an artist, I wanted to do something. And they had kind of organized it where you could do like a small thing for your community, you could do a few communities together, or you could do a national project. And so I kind of wanted to do a national project, but because that was the scale that I wanted to think in, it meant that totems, sculptures, anything that I kind of came up with, that are kind of my normal kind of work, they didn't fit because they were too local. And then it would be me pouring my own idea of really broad experience of residential school survivors into something. I would be trying to contrive that through putting meaning into the figures of a pole or whatever. So eventually I came up with this idea of gathering objects from school sites. And after I finally detached myself from the idea of it being a formal sculpture where you take stuff and you shape it, I came up with the idea of assembling them in the form of a blanket. And that was the seed of the idea. And I didn't realize it at the time, but it made so much space for so many different stories to come together through the objects that we gathered. And I really think that's the project changed so many things about how I think about the world, how I think about my role as an artist, how I think about material, how I think about storytelling. And yeah, it sort of came from the realization that the ways that I had worked until then were insufficient to tell the story that I was looking to tell.
So when I came over here that first time, you were still in the process of figuring out, even just practically, how you were going to weave these items together, but you were also still gathering artifacts, items. You showed me a few of them, and one of them that was particularly meaningful for me that I want to talk about today was a shoe from Carcross. Can you talk a little bit about that? We're both going to get emotional now.
Yeah. Early on, we were kind of feeling our way through the process of gathering, right? Like, the initial idea was to gather pieces of the buildings. And then once Rosie and the rest of the team got out and started actually meeting people and meeting survivors and going to communities, people had lots of different ideas of things. And so I realized that we just had to say yes. When somebody said, would you like this? Would you like that? We would just say yes. And then it would be on me to figure out how to incorporate that later. And one of those objects was sort of gathered from the site of a burned down residential school in Carcross. And Rosie was being guided through the site, and the shoe was kind of in the underbrush. And And the gentleman was with her, said, maybe you'd want something like this. And the reason I know this, because I wasn't there, was because we had a film crew. And so we actually filmed the gathering of this shoe, and it came out of the bushes covered in moss and lichen. And she said yes, and she took it and put it in a box. And that night at her bed and breakfast, she woke up having a nightmare. She was running in her sleep and was afraid. And it was strange to her because she doesn't have nightmares very often, but she didn't think much of it. And she came home, I think the next day. And the next night, her husband had the same dream. And when she woke him up and he described the nightmare he was having, where he was running and he was afraid, she recognized it was the same exact dream that she'd had. And the only thing that was common between the two places was this shoe. And so that next morning she came to my door holding the little box with the shoe in it. And she said, I'm sorry that I'm here so early. I need to give this to you because I can't have it in my house. But I have to tell you why. And then she shared that experience with me. That was the first time that it really struck me that this idea, the concept of objects being witnesses, was more than a turn of phrase, right? Mm-hmm. That the pieces really carry something, right? That there's stories that are inherent to them. And so I didn't know how to deal with that. I'm not a medicine person, but I felt like I needed to address it. And so I did the only thing that I could think of, which was in my own studio to that evening pull the shoe out and hold it. And I started to talk to it the way that we're talking right now. And I was describing the project and thinking about what it must be like for this shoe to have been lifted out of the forest, put in a box, whisked across the country. And I talked about what the purpose was. And in doing so, I was clarifying for myself what I was doing through the explanation that I was giving to this shoe. But I was also building a relationship, right? Like it wasn't a raw material anymore. It was a being. And I was filled with all kinds of emotion. Like I had never had, I don't think, an emotional response to an object that wasn't already personal to me, right? Like we know that like wedding rings, or like an article of clothing from a loved one who's passed on, or like we have meanings that are attached to them, right? I have dishes that were my grandmother's, and they're special. They hold meaning, right? And the meaning that we attach to them is generally from our own memories, our own experiences. This is the first time that I'd had that kind of feeling from something that was essentially a stranger to me at the time. And so I did that for 4 nights in a row. And each night I learned more. Each night the energy of the shoe felt different. And it went from being angry and afraid to sad. And if you look on the blanket, you can see that the shoe is in this little box, and that there's sage and sweetgrass and medicine cloth that are all caring for the shoe. And that was, I think that's a reflection of a shift in how I thought about what I was doing when it came to those objects.
Wow. I'm wondering if I'm ever going to have a conversation with you where I don't cry. When you showed me that shoe, it was in a Ziploc bag, and I had this sort of triple response. One was sorrow for the child who wore that shoe. But then I projected it onto my own life, and I thought about my own son, who at the time would have been about 7 or 6. Around the time had we been Indigenous and living in that time, he might have been taken from me. And then I had the unexpected response. And the thing that we're here to talk about mostly today, I thought about the shoes that I had seen at the concentration camp Majdanek, which is in Lublin, Poland. I had been there in 1998 with my mother, who was a survivor of Auschwitz. And I was with my sisters and my first cousin. And we took this tour of the camp. And it's the most eerie place. It looks like you could literally flip a switch and it would come back to life. Like everything is, it's really horrible. And in the barracks, it serves obviously as a museum, but in barrack after barrack, there were shoes, floor to ceiling, behind a barrier. I think it was glass. And the first time you walk into the barrack, it's so much. You can't believe all these shoes. And then you walk into another one, and then another one. There are so many shoes. And I thought about the people putting on their shoes for this journey east somewhere. They didn't know what it was going to be. I'm sure they didn't think they were heading to their deaths in a gas chamber, obviously. And I was just so affected by those shoes. And when you showed me this shoe, I was instantly back there in Poland on that trip, thinking about the shoes, looking at them. Later on, we went upstairs and we did the formal interview, and you said another thing that had a similar reaction for me. And it was when you talked about your father arriving at residential school. And I'm wondering if you can talk about his story, about what happened to little Victor when he got there.
Yeah. One of the things, we didn't know very many of my dad's residential school experiences. He didn't talk about them with us very often. He talked a little bit about food and how he didn't like certain kinds of food because they had really poor quality versions of it. So he won't eat scalloped potatoes. He doesn't like rice pudding. But that was kind of there was 2 or 3 stories that we heard. When he did his testimony for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and he invited us to come and sit with him. And he'd been working in a notepad and taking notes about what he was going to say. So he had been kind of processing and remembering. And we didn't know what he was going to share, but the first thing he talked about was having his hair shaved on the first day, and almost in the first moments. And his hands were shaking, he couldn't, the memory of it was in the retelling was so intense that it was physically affecting him again. And that's not an uncommon story. In fact, it's one that we've heard through the process of gathering objects for the witness blanket from lots of survivors, because that was one of the very first things that most children went through when they were first attending residential school. The girls would have their braids cut and the boys would have their heads shaved, and they would be scrubbed down and treated like filthy animals. And
often told they were.
But that has such a huge part of a person's identity held inside of it, that my sisters, upon hearing his story, decided that they would grow their hair while we were in the process of gathering objects for the blanket, and right near the end of the project, they went through ceremony and cut their braids. The whole thing was so filled with, just charged with emotion. The process of them preparing themselves, going through ceremony, and they woke up before dawn and bathed in cold water 4 mornings in a row, sort of praying to each of the 4 directions. Then on the 5th day, the hair was cut, and they prayed over their hair at sunrise to detach themselves from it. And it was a really beautiful and very intentional ceremony that's built around mourning, around grieving. And seeing them go through that, and how much it affected them, how much it affected all of us who were witnessing what they were going through, really makes me think about how jarring it must have been for my dad, and for all those other little kids who had their hair cut for the reason of trying to assimilate.
Who had just been removed from their families and their homes. Yeah. They were in this strange place, and this is the first thing that happens. Like, a haircut it's hard to begin with, often, for children. But in those circumstances?
Yeah.
So when you told me that story, and even as you're talking now, I'm thinking of, like, more parallels are coming up and, like, waving at me. The food stuff, it's a different thing, but we could not waste food in our house. We were not allowed to throw food out. Scalloped potatoes or rice pudding, we didn't get either of those, but if we had and we didn't like them, too bad, we would have eaten. And it was always because of the war. The war wasn't explicitly stated, but it was always there, probably in a similar way to your experience in your home. Maybe you didn't really know the whole story, but you knew it had to do with that, right?
Absolutely. There was a little bit of, like, trying to make sure that we had what they didn't.
Right.
Was one of the things. But also that we had to appreciate it. So clean your plate. Because I really didn't like liver. Like,
same.
And I actually ran away from home when I was 5 years old because I was told that if I didn't eat my liver, I was going to have it for breakfast. Oh. And so I packed up my Hot Wheels cars and my blankie, and I got on my bike that had training wheels, and I rode to the end of the driveway. I laugh now because my older sister, who was 3 years older than me, was chasing after me saying, "Don't go." But she found me at the end of the driveway riding in circles because I wasn't allowed to ride on the road. But when you think about that story, like, as I was learning more about the hunger and learning more about the lack of food and everything, it kind of shifts, like, why it was so important for a little kid to eat what was on their plate. Part of it was to be thankful for that food, but also I realized, kind of when I was making the blanket, that and all the information was coming out about nutritional testing and stuff, that was another way that being an intergenerational survivor affected me, right? Like, language was one, because I don't have either of my grandma or my grandpa's languages. But another one was associations with food. And so because I went through that, and Addie was little at the time, and Elaine would say to me, "You have to let her eat until she's full, not, like, listen to her body." And it was weird because, like, you know, you're told something, you grow up with it, like you think of it as the way things should be. And that really helped me kind of recognize that I was probably going to pass that on to her if I hadn't had that experience of making the blanket and learning that there's the logic behind it is like an instance of trauma that's been passed forward.
And it's a visceral thing, right? Like, I get upset when food does not get eaten, and I will force myself to finish my plate to the detriment of my waistline. But liver was also a thing in my house. Hated it, but I had to eat it, and the only way I could stomach it was to douse it in ketchup and just, you know, get it down that way. And to this day, I cannot put ketchup on meat of any sort, but I will make an exception for French fries, because ketchup is good on French fries.
That's true. I don't think we used ketchup. I would try to cut the meat small enough and then hide it in the rice. So just have like a lot of rice and then as few strips of liver as I could.
Did you have to eat the liver for breakfast the next day?
No, that was once I made the stand that I was ready to run away from home, everybody thought it was so hilarious that I didn't have to eat it for breakfast. So sometimes you have to like advocate for yourself.
Oh my gosh. So when you told the story to me about your dad having his head shaved, that was the real moment when I felt this unexpected, crazy connection with you, that we had both inherited some kind of horror story from our parents' experiences, because my mother would tell me the story about when she arrived at Auschwitz and had her hair shaved. Her head was shaved. It was one of the first things that happened. Her head was shaved. She had a tattoo imprinted on her arm. And much later, I realized it might have been the same year. It might have been 1944. I know it was 1944 for my mother, and it might have been, I did the math, for your dad that same year.
Yeah, it could have been, because it would have been really close, because he's 36, born in 36, I think. Or 38. I should know my dad's birth year. But yeah, it could be.
Yeah.
They would have been experiencing these things definitely at the same time, whether it was the exact same year or not.
The reason I heard the story, my parents would tell me the odd story, but that story somehow was turned into a good story only because right after she had her head shaved, she was reunited with her sister, who she hadn't seen for years at that point. Her sister had gone to other camps, including Majdanek, where I saw those shoes. And the story, as they would tell it to me, was that when they saw each other at Auschwitz, they laughed and laughed because they both looked so ridiculous with their head shaved. But of course, the laughter was joy at the improbable miracle of being reunited. I now understand that. But my mom always told that story as sort of a funny story. When of course it wasn't. It was the worst thing. And I thought, you know, after this had happened and years later, I was thinking about this meeting that you and I had and me having these memories of my own come up. I thought that I hadn't said anything at the time, but I went back and looked at the transcript of the first interview that we had, and I did tell you right then and there. I'm not sure I told you about the shoe, but I definitely told you about my mom having her head shaved. Do you remember that? Do you remember at all this, you know, this reporter coming and sort of unloading these really horrible details about her own life on you?
I do. And I remember how, well, because I was so like sort of starstruck that Marsha Lederman was coming. Like reporter for the Globe and Mail was coming to talk about this project. So we were all kind of like, the whole team, everybody was kind of a flutter about the reality that you were coming. And then we met and we started to go through the process of the conversation, showing you what we were doing. And I remember you like actually having an emotional pause and feeling like you had to apologize for that, saying, you know, I'm sorry that I'm not being professional, or whatever the words that we assign to those kinds of experiences are, but and how disarming that was to the kind of to the moment, because then we weren't like, I wasn't talking to like this famous reporter anymore. I was talking to a person, and we were like, I mean, if you excavate a relationship, then that was kind of the foundation of our friendship, right? Because we were making personal connections. And when you said how like you have these memories that came up for you around the braids of hair, or the cutting of hair around the shoe, that was also kind of at the time when I was starting to form the realization that although objects come with a story, or maybe a few stories, that the power of them is the way that they can reach into people and draw from their own memories, right? Like, and I think that that's largely what's been the success of the witness blanket, is there's so many different pieces that somebody's gonna find something that accesses a memory of their own. And through that, we form a connection, and then you're in relationship, whether it's us being in a friendship kind of relationship, or whether it's a person who's remembering something from their own childhood or from their own experience because of an object that they're looking at on the witness blanket. That the art, that's kind of the power of the art, right? Is that it doesn't, like, the braid doesn't tell you why it's there. You can learn about why it's there. The shoe doesn't tell you, but
But it speaks to you.
It does, because you can't help but imagine the size of the foot, and therefore the size of the person. And it contextualizes these things that we learn as facts about terrible histories in a way that personalizes them so that we can process them not here, but here. And I carry that now. Like that, some of those, and I'm kind of realizing that moment where we were talking about your own connection to shoes and braids was one of the formative moments for me recognizing that the stories of the objects were going to continue to grow as the blanket came into being and as it was seen by more and more people. Because that was right at the beginning. Yeah.
Wow. I didn't know that. I want to talk about the braids, because your sisters did this beautiful ceremony, which you just talked about, and I wrote about that later for a different story. And I didn't give it a lot of thought in terms of a personal resonance. But when I was writing my book, and you're in my book, and this connection that we've made is, I think, one of the most important things in the book, because as a Canadian, I have a responsibility to know about the residential schools tragedy, to understand the truth, to learn about it, and then to act toward reconciliation. But I'd already written it, or I'd written part of it, and I was watching, my sister Doris found a home video that she'd made of our trip to Poland in 1998, and it included a trip to Auschwitz. And there were lots of shoes there again, but the thing that really struck me at Auschwitz was the hair. So this hair that was shaved off of these prisoners was sold to companies and used in mattresses, carpets, all kinds of things. I know it's horrifying, but some of it stayed behind, and there was so much of it, like thousands of kilograms of hair was found when Auschwitz was liberated. And again, at the Auschwitz Museum, you see all this hair. And I'm watching my sister's video, and we see a braid there. And my sister said, "Mummy had braids. That could have been Mummy's braid," or something like that. I mean, it couldn't have been because her braid was long gone by then. But when she said that, I thought about you. Or when I saw her, when I watched the video of that many years later, I thought, oh my God, there's this other connection. And then I thought about how our stories get braided together over time, even though they're so different, and or at least they happened in different places, but maybe they're not so different. Your story has helped me understand mine, and my story has helped me understand yours, and has helped me understand Canada and the tragedy that we have hosted on this soil. And that's something I thought a lot about. I've thought about how my parents were able to leave, thank God they were liberated. They were able to leave Europe and come to Canada and start a new life. But for you, for Indigenous Canadians, you're here in the same place, surrounded by the colonial construct that was, so many people's undoing, and so violent and so awful to children and families. And I wonder how you deal with that.
I think about that, about the difference between people who've come here to get away from terrible things in other parts of the world, and how sometimes they thrive. Sometimes they thrive despite like the ongoing racism that exists in different forms in Canada. And then I look at the way that a lot of First Nations communities are sort of trapped in a bit of a cycle where it's difficult to detach from trauma when the cause of your trauma is still all around you. And I think about it in terms of people who are going through addiction. And they remove themselves from community, they go to treatment, they come out feeling, and I've seen this with so many friends and so many family members, feeling grounded and powerful. And then they're re-immersed in the cause of the trauma that is a part of, or a condition of, addiction to begin with, right? And so I wonder about that, right? Like, as Indigenous people, we have such a strong connection to our lands, to community, and at the same time, our lands and our communities are not the way that they were for our ancestors anymore, because we're under colonial law. Even when we talk about inherent Indigenous rights, even when we have Supreme Court cases that recognize those rights, we still have to fight for control over our lands, to have a voice in how the resources are extracted, to include in our decision-making as a society responsibility to future generations. And I think that it's kind of like one of the, what do you say, like a blessing and a curse, right? Because I can't imagine living somewhere else, far away from these cedar trees, far away from the ocean. I like to go and visit places, but when I come back here, I know I'm home. And part of that is Canada. And then I have to add in that I'm of mixed ancestry, where Kwakwaka'wakw and Coast on my father's side, and English, Irish, Scottish settler on my mom's side, and how my great-grandparents who came here to be given land, and they were given the same land that was taken from my dad's family. And so, in a way, I'm complicit, or at least half of me is. And so there's this tension, right, that exists in trying to grapple with, understand, wrap your arms around what it means to grow up in this country as an Indigenous person, and also as someone who has settler ancestry and whose family has benefited from, and therefore I continue to benefit from that. It's complicated, right? Those feelings.
Yeah. When things get hard, we think about, going on a pilgrimage sometimes. And I went through a hard time in my life, and I thought, I want to go somewhere that's going to be meaningful to me, but I don't have a home to go to. I don't have land that was my people's land. I have nowhere to go, which is a different problem than you have. You have the land, which is, it's part of you. It's part of you. It's in you. And I feel a little bit just kind of not grounded, because there is no ground that is mine, if you know what I mean. Like, Poland is not my homeland. Germany is not my homeland, where my parents were married. I guess Canada is my homeland, but I'm also a settler, and I carry that weight too. So it's a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot of layers to thinking through what it all means, right? And it's probably on the other side. There's I said it was a blessing and a curse as an Indigenous person. It's also, I think that the part of the reason that I want to do work like the Witness Blanket is not to shame my white side, to borrow a phrase from my sister, but to acknowledge it, to recognize that the impacts of colonialism, whether they're residential schools, or whether the formation of reserves or the clearing of the plains, sterilization of Indigenous women, MMIWG2S plus, and the violence that's meets so many Indigenous women. That's another reality that's part of this country, or those are other realities that are part of this country. And so how do we bring an end to them? First, we have to acknowledge that they exist, right? And then we have to sort out how they came into being. Like how does the mindset that places Indigenous people in a situation where governments feel like they have to look after us, the paternalism. And it comes back to that shaving of heads, treating like animals. Like it goes all the way back to terra nullius and the idea that these were empty lands, meaning that the people, the many millions of people who were here when contact was first made, were not seen as human. And I think that although nobody would say that today, that the structures that were designed when that was what people believed, because the Indian Act was made then. And it was made to look after something less than human, right?
And it's still in place.
It's still in place. And we have these different structures and ideas that have become part of the status quo around who gets to make decisions about where you draw minerals from the ground, where you draw water from the ground, how you manage fishing, how you manage forests. These are all things that Indigenous people have been doing here for millennia. And maybe we've got it reversed. Like what would the forests look like if they were always under First Nations management? I think that it would be quite different from the less than 20% of old growth ecosystems that remain, because we would have been approaching the use of those resources in a much different way.
There has been a lot of change in terms of awareness, non-Indigenous awareness, mainstream awareness of colonialism, the violence of it, the impacts of it, residential schools in particular, since you began the Witness Blanket Project and to now. And I wonder how that's affected your work, or maybe it hasn't, I don't know.
There's been enormous shifts. I remember the first time Justice Sinclair said cultural genocide, and the resistance and the outcry and the op-eds that filled the pages of the newspapers in this country, declaring that that's not what it was. And then recently, it was unanimously recognized as genocide in Parliament. That's all parties coming together and thinking differently about what our history means. So there's that. There's those incremental shifts, and then there's moments that catalyze them. And I think that one of them was the confirmation of unmarked graves that came out of Kamloops about 1.5 years ago, and how that really shocked the world. And I say confirmation because it was not a surprise to me or anybody from Indigenous communities, because we knew those graves were there. They were talked about. It was a surprise to those who weren't paying as close attention. And how can you not pay attention when all of a sudden you're talking about now? I mean, at the time they said 215, but the number is in the thousands now.
Yeah.
Of unmarked grave sites that have been located. And how can you not, just as a person, like you said, you had a triple response because you thought about it, thought about your own son. I do the same thing. I have a daughter. I imagine what it would be like for her. And bones of children is a really, really difficult visual to process. And I don't know if we can, I think that made an enormous change in this country. And maybe in the way that this country is seen. And at the time, when asked, I would say, this is what we have to make this part of our identity now, right? Like, one of the things that I've noticed in the times that I've spent in Germany is how present the Holocaust is in art, in culture, in museums, in conversation. It is not something that is kept quiet. And it's very much part of the identity of Germans of today. And I think that we need to have the same sort of reckoning here, where part of what it means to be Canadian is knowing and talking about colonialism, about residential schools, and teaching about them in our schools, and making sure that awareness is there, because that's how we start to deconstruct those things that lead to what we were talking about just a minute ago, about how does it feel to still have it all around us.
Yeah.
Like when we talk about reconciliation or talk about decolonization, those are two different things. One is about relationships, one is about structures. At least that's how I think about them. And like, what does it mean to decolonize the way that we govern, and to actually embrace the idea of nationhood, and to build strong relationships in determining how to live in relationship with these lands that we currently call Canada.
So you and I know this work is really important for both of us to remember what happened, to ensure that others remember what happened, to ensure that it never happens again, and to move forward in a positive way. And I thought we could end by you talking about what you're doing now.
Well, because of the weight of looking backwards, of learning about the depths of trauma, of intergenerational trauma, of the exploring of my own, the ways that it affects me and my family and it sometimes feels like it's all too much. Like there's no, like we're being defined by it. And as much as I know how critical it is to make sure that projects like the Witness Blanket are out there to create awareness so that everybody can learn, because we talked about how the awareness is shifting. So we need those projects that talk about history, that contextualize it, and make it feel real to everyone. What I don't want to be is defined by it. So I started to try to think about what I could do. How could I make art that was still serving the same purpose around the resurgence of culture, around creating awareness of what it means to be an Indigenous person, but that wasn't framed by colonialism, that wasn't limited by it. And so, I mean, it took a while, and I still haven't even got it all the way up and running, but I'd been making I make totems, right? And I make them from old growth trees. And at a point I realized that the way that these trees have been managed means that in my lifetime, there will very likely be none left for me to carve. And so by making them, I was sort of complicit in speeding toward the final destruction of them. And I decided to look for different ways, and using second growth cedar and assembling them. And even though I'm still doing that because I like the ideas, I'm actually working on one outside right now where we're cutting second growth beams that we can form into a big long cylinder that will be carved into a totem that'll have the same scale as these big old growth, but will be made from second growth trees. And it was like, oh, I'll do this, and then I can sort of show industry and policymakers that we don't have to just keep cutting down the old growth because it's the easy thing to do. We actually do have the technology and the creativity to make new things possible. So I like it, but it's still a reaction, right? It's a reaction to a shortage. And so then I came up with this idea of that I call the seedling. And it's really hopeful for me because, in short, what the idea is we'll plant a Western red cedar tree. I will design a totem using 3D software. And the University of Victoria has agreed to make and raise the pole when the tree is full grown. And that's 600 to 1,000 years from now. And what makes it so exciting for me is the ideas of carving poles, the culture that should define me, should define my people, came from before colonialism. So in a way, we can look at these carvings and think how they're a representation of something that's pre-colonial and therefore unaffected by it and not defined by it. And we can take that and place it way into the future, in a time beyond, and imagine time beyond colonialism, and have it guide us there. And so in it, you have to change the relationship with land, because we have to make sure that the climate could still grow a tree here. You have to learn how to plan on a much different time scale than economic or political, which are like quarterly, annually, every 4 years. Like, this is planning 30 generations forward. You have to figure out how to make agreements that last that long, so that the next president of the university doesn't just decide not to do it.
And instructions that will last that long, right? With technology changing. Would you just do plain old pen and paper?
It has to be in technology, because technology is part of the solution. It's also part of the problem, because we design technology to fail, right? Like to be in service of profit. We update our phones all the time. We accept that we need to get a new cell phone every 3 years or however long they're going to build to last. So it has to live that way. And then we have to care for that. So change your relationship with technology, change your relationship with land, change the length of time that we allow to dictate the decisions we make. And it's multidisciplinary, right? It's people coming together from lots of different areas, and through art, and through a promise, maybe plant little seeds in systems that grow into a new way of being.
Oh, it's such a great idea. It's so beautiful and hopeful. You know, we talked a little bit about this before, but I worry about also being defined by the horrors of my parents and their parents and my ancestors. And there were surveys recently taken of Canadian and also separately American Jews, and they were asked about, what's the most important thing as their when it comes to their Jewish identity. And the Holocaust was right up there, number 1 in the US, I believe, and number 2 in Canada. And that was really upsetting to me because I don't want to be defined by that. At the same time, one of the things I read that was so was another aha moment, as Oprah would say, was that these researchers who work with children of Holocaust survivors notice that these children of survivors as adults were identifying themselves still as children. How do I define myself? Oh, I'm a child of Holocaust survivors. Well, I'm a woman in my 50s and I'm still talking about my parents. I'm not looking at myself in a different way in relation to my child or my position, etc. And I thought that was really interesting too. And I don't want to be defined by a horrible thing, but that doesn't mean I need to suppress, or I should suppress that horrible thing. It's beautiful when these horrible things spur us on to do beautiful things like the seedling. And I'm so glad that you're doing that. And I'll have to think of something. It can't involve nature because I'm very bad at nature, but maybe it'll be something else. I don't know. Maybe this.
Yeah. Wow. That's a really interesting observation about thinking of ourselves as the children of survivors. And I hadn't really thought about how I still say, I'm the son of a survivor. Because I'm also a father of a young girl who's probably going to say that she's the child of a intergenerational survivor.
Or the granddaughter of a survivor. And you're right, like, you don't want to be defined by it. I'd rather be maybe defined by the resilience that carried our people through the challenges and the horrors that we've faced, but also like that idea that the Holocaust is at the very top of the list of what it means to be Jewish is maybe we can't break free from that, but maybe that becomes part of who we are. It's a lot to think about, isn't it? I have to thank you, not just for this conversation, not just for everything you've done, everything you've taught me, but you said something to me that completely switched my thinking around, and you just reminded me of it. And I think it's a really good way for us to end this part of the conversation. You and I were talking on the phone at one point, and you said to me, you talked about blood memory and how what is in our blood, what we have from our ancestors can't just be about the trauma, but it has to be about the strength and resilience, because we got that too. And that was just such an important epiphany for me. And I think about everything differently since you've said that to me. So I think we're both warriors. We're strong, we're resilient, and you've done so much for me and for this country that I just want to say thank you.
Well, I think that you can maybe take a little bit of the credit, because before you wrote that first article about the witness blanket, nobody knew about it. And then you put it on the front page of the Globe and Mail, and you kind of think about like all the dominoes that have to the pieces of the puzzle have to fall into place for big things to happen. And what would have happened if you hadn't have gotten that memo and hadn't to go, oh, that's interesting, maybe I want to write about that. I don't know how it might have changed the course or the direction of the project, but I do know that by coming and writing about it, immediately doors were opened. Because when we went to communities, people would say, oh, it's that project that I read about. And so I guess that's part of it, right? And so I want to say thank you back because I think that maybe it's the idea, right? Maybe it's the idea of these things that is what pulls people in. Maybe it was that the concept of what is attached to these objects that drew you there in the first place. So maybe it's neither of us. Maybe it's the art.
Maybe it's the ancestors.
And the ancestors.
Thank you, Carey.
Thank you, Marsha.